Whoops. All right, let's take a drink. Let's take a break. Coffee break, everyone. I think I mentioned this before when I was playing an indie game. I don't know which one it is. Oh, I wasn't playing an indie game. This was when I was talking about was I talking about an indie game? Well, never mind that. It was either Like a Dragon Gaiden or potentially Battle Bands. It's within that time period. I talked about things like being creative in... Oh, it's not Like a Dragon Gaiden. It might actually be... It's something that dealt with skill development. So, a lot of times video games nowadays tend to utilize pause screens and, in my opinion, underutilize pause screens or like rest periods, right? Oh, I think it was a take on live service models. So it was dealing with Neverwinter Online. But the idea, the reason why this came up is the coffee break and the popcorn is an excellent understanding of how psychology works, the human condition works when it comes to doing something potentially incredibly intellectually strenuous, right? And to give you, I don't know if it was intentionally designed this way with this in mind, but nevertheless it came up, it coincidentally aligned. The idea is to integrate reward for taking a breather or for relaxing or taking a break, because one of the prevalent, I almost feel, although it's difficult to demonstrate, I know I'm digressing already. However, the idea, the importance of rest and interval, just taking short intervals of break from a current mindset, right? A current focus. And this is true for both physical and mental tasks. Video games these days, there's an inherent normalization of learning curve and feeling of progress. And generally speaking, one of the core ways to improve and grow and learn efficiently is often to understand how to take a break and utilize that break. So, for example, nowadays, especially Twitch, emphasizes an always on hustle culture, right? You're always on. The great feats and admiration of human qualities is to do inhumanly like things. And one of the things is to do something for a very long time, consistently, and hoping to improve. Naturally speaking, an understand of human psychology and human biology would suggest that's not sustainable. It may be sustainable for a short period of time, to get your likes, your clicks, your fame, but inevitably it's not sustainable. One of the most underutilized pieces of growth, both physically and mentally, is urging and reminding, almost requiring discipline now, to not succumb to the hustle culture and to embrace respite, a period of reconciliation, right? Consolidate your experiences. So like when I'm going back to Osu, a rhythm game that I play very often, the break you take pays back so much more than rigorously grinding your way consistently. So if anyone's ever had a moment of mental block or physical block, take a rest. Think about something else. Let your mind wander to related things that isn't the task. And when you come back to it, you, more often than not, it's a very intuitive process that is inexplicable for people who are intuitive about this. But it's very beneficial. For someone like myself, it's kind of consistently demonstrated, like empirically, that this works. So when you're doing a puzzle game, now we're going to take it back to why this is important and why I'm thinking about this as we're watching the animation, a second animation of our little dude taking a coffee break. This is, in my opinion, I don't know if the developers thought of it this way, or maybe they do this too when they're working and designing and creating the puzzle game. It takes, either they're projecting this theme or like this little touch, or it is part of the process. Either way, it's incredible, which is the idea that to me, this communicates to me that this developer understands what it's like to play puzzle games, to have very difficult logic or maybe out of the box logic for the time being, or non-intuitive logic being bootstrapped. So what happens is you need to take a break. So how to maximize that encouragement? Well, program a simple animation loop to encourage someone to take a break. They might not understand what the intellectual benefits or even the intuitive benefits at first, but just doing stuff like this can increase what do the developers get out of this? Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's not. And what do the publishers get out of this? Well, typically it means, you'd be surprised with these tiny breaks, that the player ends up playing longer, but they play longer more happily and more likely to show more consistent improvements, and that increases longer sessions, but in a more healthier way, not the type where the game continues to press you forward without encouraging and maybe even rewarding a really fun little animation to take a break. So games don't do that these days. In fact, the culture around gaming industry, or not the developers and the publishers, it's kind of indirectly the fault of the design of the developers and publishers, not in a bad or good way, it's unintended, right? The gamers tend to retain, have better progress, faster learning returns, a healthier relationship with your game, and therefore it creates better response, and whether they know it or not, it enhances their experience overall. So it is very incentive. It's a bonus for developers and publishers to consider the idea of how do you creatively make your game an enjoyable experience while learning a complex topic. So for example, if I walk into the room and I'm teaching the nuances of the viral life cycle of retroviruses in Gallus, the domestic chicken, right? I would try to integrate ways of breaking the rhythm, even speech. I do it all the time. When I begin to hit my my big PowerPoints, I start becoming a little bit more animated. I move my hands, stop my hands, then I breathe. You swap up the dynamics. it's also contextually interesting too. So you can deviate a little bit and then take it back. It's to help keep people alert, make the process dynamic, but it's also actively resting the person. If you hyper focus on something for long enough, yes, I do actually earnestly believe people have specific attention spans, but not in the conventional sense where people talk about, oh, we all have shortened attention spans because we can't seem to focus on one scene for 5 minutes or for 10 seconds or whatnot. It's not necessarily that. It is sort of that, but in the context of how alert and how active someone can be. And you can focus on a topic and a context even while taking a break from it. What you do is you reframe the context. So in this case, I'm playing a puzzle game, right? I'm playing a monster expedition. But there's a time for a coffee break and just take it in. It's still within the context of the game, but what it does is it breaks the cadence of what you're doing. So what happens now is I will feel refreshed. I'm appreciating the animation. I did this gigantic, sort of, slightly digression that's relevant to this animation. I stop thinking about the puzzles. Maybe if you're someone who's struggling with insecurity or afraid that things will get too hard, what happens is this break resets you. It takes you away from having to worry about the next puzzle. And then when you approach the next puzzle, you'll feel refreshed. Mentally. Obviously not literally, unless you actually have a cup of coffee too. For me, I take some water in. And it's a really, really wonderful design that I see less and less of in video games. And what it is, in my opinion, a consequence of making people obligated to FOMO, the fear of missing out. So for example, when a game is launched, there's only a specific window to get in on the wave, right? People don't take breaks. The hustle culture is true blue, incredibly resonating both in developer design, publisher design, and the end user. They are positively feeding back on each other about getting things done fast, getting things done well, learning really fast. I'm going to put learning in quotes because technically, if you're repeating the same type of philosophy and process over and over again, you don't necessarily learn new things. You refine things you already learned. So in a way, it's kind of learning, but not in the sense of creativity or novelty. When you take a break, that's when you get to consolidate. If you think that, all right, well, your mind operates differently. The body, what are evidence that you can't control? Well, how your body works. Biologically, the only time you're actually synthesizing the experience you gain is when you're resting. Like the vast majority of your learning experience, mechanically, literally, physically, is when you rest, not when you're actively doing the task. Luckily for us, in my opinion, it's very fortunate. Mentally, it's still efficacious to take shortened breaks. So even you're in a time crunch, you have to do this task in one day, take 5-minute breaks. If you have a month, take day breaks. Work 6 times a week, right? Take Sunday off. Work 5 times. There's a very, very neat correlation and tons of converging evidence that even if we didn't understand how biology and psychology worked, without longitudinal studies and empirical evidence, in the end, when we use this like bottom line approach and ceiling approach to optimizing the workforce universally and whatnot, it ended up you know, not coincidentally optimizing for the longest possible period a human can stay actively effective and productive while punctuated by breaks. And it's generally those who can time manage the most effective schedule to integrate as many forms of breaks that doesn't push the person to hyper focusing on something, the more efficient their time becomes. So what I'm saying is, when you're working smart, it can increase your productivity. Whether it makes you happy or not, that's a different story. Someone who wants to work an honest day's labor, right, or put in 14 hours a day and feel happy about it, that is definitely a principle. It's a subjective manner, right? But what I'm saying is it doesn't change the fact that if that person did not work 14 hours a day and worked, well, they can keep working 14 hours a day, but if they say they reduce it to 11 hours a day and took 1 hour breaks, 3 1-hour breaks, they worked 11 hours and had 3 1-hour breaks making up the 14 hours, it would be almost certain, right, observationally, empirically, not about the person's mood or anything, they would probably be more productive with their time. Not only do they feel physically rested or better, right, because they got breaks, they will likely accomplish the task just as efficiently after the adaptation period, and also being open-minded subjectively to doing it. That's kind of the idea. So if you're not subjectively open to it, it doesn't really matter. It's a nocebo effect. So if you don't believe that you can work less time by integrating more rest, and you truly firmly believe that, you'll produce a nocebo effect. Basically, if you're not happy with it, I'm not here to convince you it's true. I'm only here to suggest that someone as talented and hardworking as someone who works 14 hours a day can most definitely accomplish the same task in 8 hours with an additional 6 hours of rest time for themselves. And this is kind of what this is. This is what this reminds me of. It's beautiful. It's I don't know if that's what they were going for, or they naturally came upon it being people who program puzzle games. It's very logical. You get diminished return for doing something consistently for a very long time. If you break up that tandem, you actually gain even more return on investment. So take a break, have a coffee break. If you're cramming for schoolwork and you know you've procrastinated, I'm going to use that word loosely, and the exams tomorrow, studying 14 hours straight instead of saying studying 2 4-hour sessions with a 4-hour break in between, I can almost say statistically, if this was ever done, I would say I'm on the side where the person managed to take a break in between the studying. They will ultimately probably perform not statistically significant, as in they will perform similarly, right? There is a chance one method might minorly improve the things, but what that person gained was a rest period. So what they gained was not relevant to their performance of their study. What they gained was sustainability. So yes, if you study for 8 hours with a 4-hour break instead of studying 12 hours straight, you will likely perform not statistically significant. The most important message here is that you got 4 hours of rest. You get to have 4 hours of rest. So it's not like some secret hack that instantly makes you better at something. It makes it more sustainable. this addresses one of the shortcomings of science studies in general. It's very, very difficult to perform longitudinal studies, which are effects that happen over a long period of time. We are human beings that live 100 years. Studies as much as we want probably average like 5 years. A reasonable longitudinal studies is 5 years. So inherently, most human beings who don't even operate in the scientific community have a poor understanding. It's not bad or good, just have an ignorance, a blissful ignorance of what is sustainability, or imagining sustainability. Like, for example, this is gonna go into a digression, so we're gonna prop this up. I'll talk about this for another 30 minutes or so, because I kind of enjoy this. This segues into the idea of there are two different spheres of cognitive dissonance. One I visited before, which is population statistics. It's unfathomable or very non-intuitive, even if you feel like you're logical. If you're not in a field that operates with population statistics, like big numbers, scaling, exponential growth, that type of thing, when you're analyzing the impact or interpreting the impact of data, it can be skewed because you spend most of the time thinking about yourself as an individual instead of thinking about it as a large pool of population. So we've done that digression before, where like there's sampling bias, self-selection. When people make commentaries on what is the right and wrong thing to do, it's often sampling bias. It's due to sampling bias and not understanding population. That will be a digression for another day. The second point is time, how rates work, and like things like longevity, habit formation, process improvement, skill building, mental wellness. All that is with respect to time. And time in a dominant hustle culture community, which is the internet, right, dominated by the hustle culture, has eroded even ignorance, which typically a form of understanding, someone who can understand time, as in like things take time, even with the ignorance of the actual semantics or the context of the stuff. Like, say, I don't understand anything about technology, but I am not ignorant to what time can produce. So naturally, it will allow me to be faithful and trustworthy to the process with the ignorance of the context. That has eroded completely due to the hustle culture because it's incredibly biased towards one perspective. So for example, video games publication is a great place to illustrate this dissonance. Someone would argue that I purchased $60 for this game, and because you can only see the transaction of $60 and a finished product, the value system that they understand, how they evaluate and argue about, is this game worth the innovation, did it innovate, and all that stuff, and is it worth $60, have no consideration for how long it takes to produce that product, how long it took you to produce $60. If you take into that account, there will be an element of faith and empathy, not an element of righteous indignation that's apathetic and dehumanizing. So here's an example. I bought this game. It's definitely not worth $60. They probably just, like, what did they do? They probably just sat around and been lazy. Look at this bug. Like, did they even try to fix this bug? There's those comments come out incredibly easily for someone who has no concept of how long things take, because they have ignorance of that process. It's not bad or good, it's thinking about the empathy. This person cannot empathize because they act intuitively based on their experiences. So if they're not a game developer, they haven't been through the game developing process and how to empathize how bugs elude human eyes. It's very difficult. It's exponentially more complex. Even the simplest things may be very complex. But let's think about what the cost is. So you as an individual is evaluating if something is worth it to millions of people. This is an integration of population statistics and time, right? So you're telling me that you're $60, right, for a game. I'm just spinning this. I don't really know enough about this, but let's put in some perspective just to maybe reevaluate or inspire some reevaluation. So you're $60. Say in the United States, I'm just going to use a round number. The minimum wage is $10. It really isn't, but let's just say it's $10. So you're telling me that you're $6 today as an individual because you're evaluating the value of a game based on just you, and then moral grandstanding for millions of other people who probably most definitely do not share your very specific case opinion. As in, there's no one on this planet that shares the same case opinion as you because you are unique. You have circumstances, but you attempt to generalize that, right? You use them as a moral grandstand, as in, I care about other people because if I say this isn't worth it, I'm warning other people not to waste their money. That's moral grandstanding, and that's usually inferred. Nevertheless, that's a projection of themselves. So they believe, let's do this objectively, right? They tend to favor objectivity. A game that probably had an average of 6 to 7 years of development, considering hundreds to possibly thousands of people who maybe work on and off. You can make an argument. They need breaks too, right? Maybe they took a break cumulatively of 1 year of the 7 years. So that's kind of fair, right? 1 in 7, as in 1 day in 7 days. They probably took a break like every Sunday. And then you tack on a few holidays, we'll go about like 2 years out of the 5 years. That's a fairly reasonable way to consider time, length, and population statistics. That's a very reasonable thing. So you're telling me that if you get paid $10 an hour and you worked less than a day's 8-hour work day, that money is not worth 5 years worth of development work hours of potentially thousands of people. Just putting in go. The answer could be yes. Like, for those people who are upset about what I said, it could still be yes, and I respect that. Like, I'm just offering a contextualizing population with your commentary, right? You're talking about how it's not worth it to you. So if you were a person who worked on something for 7 years, how much is that worth? It certainly is not going to be 2/3 of a workday. And even then, without even talking about like the return per how many people buying it and all that stuff, generally speaking, I would say if you can connect with how much time and how much money with respect to time, and also the human element of using up time, faith and trust becomes more robust in a person. So for example, that might have potentially softened and reach a better understanding to developers and publishers about how much something is worth. I'm not, let's just say I'm not going to be changing a lot of people's minds about how they feel, because if they made a game that they spent 7 years making, and they can hypothetically say, yeah, I'd be comfortable for selling it for $10 for sure, taking into account all like the cost of living and inflation, all that, definitely $10. Like, all the power to you. That's a great hypothetical situation. And the only way to remove all doubt is to do it. And unfortunately, that's where, much like scientific experiments, longitudinal experiments like that are rare. So, in order to literally prove the point to me, you have to spend the next 7 years developing a game and then selling it for $10 and feel emotionally completely justified, and your righteous indignation is satisfied because I will believe you. And that is incredibly unreasonable for me to suggest, because your life is let's just say an average of 70 to 80 years, right? In using the United States life expectancy as a thing. Much like it's unreasonable to go out and boycott a game that was made for 7 years by someone else and expect them to be able to empathize with that too. So, faith has been eroded by hustle culture, and it's often burdened by an inability to understand population statistics and time. And how does that affect everything that's more interesting to me, right? Like, I talk about business a lot and business philosophy because the hustle culture focuses on that. It's always about commercialism and trying to objectify subjective IPs, like placing dollar signs and values on an idea, on human creativity. What I'm extending to now is taking it back full circle to the idea of taking breaks during games. Games are not breakful. Like in a way, it's mutual. The developer and designer typically wants you to continue consuming, expecting you to consume their game. And I'm not talking about all developers, obviously, because a Monsters Expedition developers clearly don't do that. But we're talking about the indie scene here. That don't do that. But in the mainstream, they want you to consume, like addiction, borderline addiction. It's not because it's necessarily intentionally malicious. It's very efficacious for their goals. The end user don't necessarily reject this either. So inherently, whether it's a chicken or the egg problem or not, both sides are conveniently reinforcing each other's habits. We got to produce more games. They got to last longer. We got to keep the player satisfied for as long as possible. The end user, we got to get more content. We must consume consistently, and this game better keep our attention all the time. So effectively, in both cases, it leads to video games needing to be designed in a way that can achieve that effect. And the consequence of that could be the exploitation of FOMO, the insecurity of missing out. That is incredibly effective because the hustle culture is associated with the need to always be on top of things. Always on. What has that done if you understand the human condition? Well, it created what I would argue a growing epidemic, an emergent growing epidemic of insecurities, non-sustainable mental health, overworked mentally, people just incredibly overworked with no essence of being able to develop skills on regulating and exercising discipline on one's own understanding of their own capacities, right? So for example, now you have youth that is conditioned to normalize the idea that you can't put down the smartphone. You can't miss the next big game. You have to work everything for the next big thing. There's no time for breathers. Walking outside is a crime because the moment you walk outside, there's a chance you might miss something. You can't leave the house without your smartphone because you might miss something. It's not a bad or a good thing. It's an exploitation of the human condition. Fearing of missing out is incredibly effective, and it's a consequence of the relationship between both the end user and the developers and publishers, etc. The gamers want to feel like they always need something and they love something and they need to have it. Well, one of the most effective human conditions is to prey or exploit the fear of missing out, and it's very effective. So inherently, the thing that might have made you love a game or feel attached to the game is also the thing that makes you violently aggressive, boycotting, and disagreeable over time. So for example, as a designer, as a developer, right? Like, I'm not literally a programmer or a developer, but if I was part of a development team, I would take into the consideration of fostering a healthy, amicable, and mutually synergistic relationship with my community. So integrating designs like this, where there's a chill point or a design that mechanically or lucratively is not resonant at first, right? Like, no one likes to take breaks during a game. They want to keep going. But over time, if you foster a community, understanding that breaks are inherent in the game and it feels normal, I can almost assert, I'm not a psychology major or anything like that, right? But I would like to say that in the long run, longitudinally, right, 10 plus years, this developer will continue to have a healthy working environment and relationship with the reception of their community, because both their community and the developer understands, or at least fosters, a sustainable lifestyle. It's not that they literally do the same thing, but there's core human, it's a human condition because it's core to what it's like to be human. Breaks happen. Your games should support the idea of taking breaks. What happens? Well, if someone likes the game, they're likely the person who appreciates the messages that are given in the game, which is like taking a break. And this is fantastic. I don't think I see this very commonly in games. There used to be a point where, you know, resting periods or save points are strategically placed somewhere to warn the player, the end user, yeah, you know, maybe it's time to take a break for now. Actually, by coincidence, this isn't the only game. Like a Dragon, the Ryuka Gotoku Studios actually does strategically and almost thematically it's not so subtle, where even literally the characters tell you, hey, you know, this can be really dangerous. Do you want to save or like maybe even take a break? It can get really intense, right? It's subtle, it's intuitive, so people don't like your community doesn't have to be people who are incredibly perceptive where, oh yeah, I see what they're doing here. They could feel good naturally by saying, oh yeah, you know what? I really like this game. I can't quite pinpoint why, but it just feels like I'm never stressed and I always feel like I'm getting better. And it feels so rewarding to see my progress, especially after I walk away and come back. So, ignorance is bliss too, for sure. Just the idea that this dissonance with population statistics and time is reinforced by the internet in general. Like it's there's so much to talk about that reinforces this narrative, but one of them is gaming. You have people who spend so much time with gaming philosophy that I don't want to place overburdening responsibilities on developers or designers or like publishers. However, you are in charge of a medium representation that legitimately conditions a whole generation of impressionable youth. We're not specifically talking about adults who went through maturation in various environments, but specifically I'm more concerned about the youth. Being a game developer, I would say if I was part of game developer, there's another sense of legacy or impact that a developer has or a publisher has, and that's to make conscious decisions and design points that ultimately pays back to you with great comments and reviews and ratings, and that's to instill and communicate moderation in your game, because moderation is sustainable. It creates consistency. Yes, your game isn't going to blow up in a matter of days, right? Because so many people, but the long run is, I would argue, you probably will outlast those games in legacy. You're not, in my opinion, it is very respectful, it is very admirable for people who are not caught up in the hustle culture of the internet and the hustle culture of business in general. Like, you know, you hit the ground running, you have a hit, let's just slam on that hit, do not hit the brakes. Well, let's just think about the most consistent, rich, loyal, gatekeeping communities in the mainstream. What are the characteristics of their lifestyle? Well, the community they have are largely made up of ignorance, but of ignorance, loyalty, and faith, because they played the long game. They treated end users like human beings, and end users treated them like human beings, even when it's represented by a large conglomerate, right? So we're talking about Apple, Microsoft, even like I would say the specialty here would be Amazon, where it's an investment in the people. You might make an argument, well, there's this and that. It's like, it does not ever change the observation that there is incredibly blind loyalty, right? And that is catering to the idea that you make design decisions, you make investments that ultimately reinforces human condition to be sustainable. Of course, there's so many actions, so many things. There are missteps and proactive ways of doing this, but overall, those companies or those big, consistent people have a mutual relationship. with their community, whether it is predatory or not, is sustainable. The ones that sustain the longest have elements of understanding and having the hindsight and foresight of understanding how a product can exist for a very long time. What is one of those products? A smartphone. Well, a smartphone in itself is just a device. It's empty. Like, it could have gone the way of a calculator. But what made it an integral part of human life is they made it to offer the conveniences that in the long run becomes integral to human life. So when you're making a game or making a video game, and you're making a video game series, and you're expecting your community to stay around or always come back and trust you, you're investing forward. If you make a smash hit, which unfortunately for better or for worse, I can think of a few indie studios that went on to expand and they just hit rock bottom the next time because they threw out the coincidental philosophy of investing forward for a quick return, right? So to me, if your audience are human beings and you're a developer who are considering yourself human beings, you might not consider yourself as human beings. What I mean is you might consider yourself as a near robotic worker, someone who works really hard, then that's fair. Your development team will probably be driven and you'll probably have a lot of turnover. A great example would be Blizzard Entertainment, a lot of turnover, right? And that is sustainable, just like labor workers and whatnot. Those things work. But ideally, you want retention. You want a development team to stay with you, form bonds, longevity, and the end user to be the same. That's a long game. That's playing the long game. And a lot of times, some people talk about how they're a great judge of character, yet they're dehumanizing developers and publishers. They're dehumanizing everything they're talking about, and anyone who opposes them, well, that's probably not a person. That's probably a person who's more catered towards the hustle bustle. That's fantastic. I mean, like, they can stick to that. What I'm talking about is the person who understands that if you are a good judge of character, you can also see the long game. The game that many developers that I will be talking about in another 10 years will be far more consistently successful than and be well received than the ones that exist today that are popular and are going for the hustle bustle. So, yes, Ubisoft is probably a great example of a company that went hustle bustle. They didn't invest forward. They rigorously expanded on an idea rapidly until it was dulled out. Let's take an opposite effect. Rockstar. You know, GTA 6 is still not around that corner. You know? But what they're doing is they're investing forward. It's a really, really big long shot, but they have already cultivated an almost cult-like loyalty. We can even argue Apple, right? Apple products, closed ecosystem. It is predatory in some way, I would say. Like, arguably, you can make that debate. But what it is investing forward. It's for mechanically best or worse, whatever the interest is. Catering to consistent human, like sustainable human habits is ultimately a win-win. Like, what I mean is a win-win from the designer standpoint. And I think, just to wrap this digression up, for the inspiration for this digression, this team Dragneck, and friends, among a few others of recent memory, will be here to stay. They understand integrating lifestyle conveniences. It might be a coincidence. I don't know. I don't have direct contact with the developers. But things like this foster healthy mental wellness that will enable one to, like, say someone really hates this game or having an incredibly hard time playing the puzzles. Integrating something like this can soften the blow. It might even get them over the hump and retain that player. If you remove this, well, there's no chance of it happening. There's no chance of it slowing down. And what you end up selecting is, certainly you select for those people who are more dedicated and committed initially, but you also exclude everyone else who isn't about it. There's no faith. There's no trust. And designers, in my opinion, developers have a great, like, especially indie developers, because they don't have to play by the standardized rule of hustle and bustle on the mainstream. If you integrate, like, say, a stopping point, a resting point, and animate that, yes, it doesn't add to the game's mechanic. It doesn't add to, and it might not be appreciated at first, but I can almost guarantee, I would say like 80% of the time, once the game, if you are able to retain a player population over time, that resting period, those things become more and more salient over time. Like, what I mean is, you will hear remarks from longtime players like, yeah, man, this is awesome. I'm enjoying this rest stop with a custom background music. It really makes me feel cozy and I can just go again. Because it's habit forming. People need rest. So that's the take home message. Like, really understanding human psychology and developing a game that meets your needs and your vision, but at the same time retaining and playing to not, you don't, in my opinion, developers and publishers don't have to exploit FOMO. There's an incredibly other, more proactive, arguably, of course, from a non-specialist, there are incredibly other sources of motivation for a gamer to quote-unquote exploit, but in a synergistic manner. And one of them is to provide treats for resting, or implying that one, you don't have to play 16 hours straight today. You can play 4 hours for the next 4 days. In fact, why don't you take a week off and, you know, like, distract them, basically. So lots of distraction. What is making, in my opinion, what do I like about Ryuka Gotoku Studio, Like a Dragon Studio? They actually take that to the next level. Their design inherently incorporates distractions from the single task. So you don't literally rest, you actively rest. I know how that sounds. In a puzzle game like this, the only form of active resting is to use the game itself for a literal, for metaphorical or virtual resting. However, you make a bigger game, you could make 2 or 3 core tasks and compartmentalize them so that they're actively resting from a different task. So, for example, mini games, right? If you're going at this mini game and then you get distracted to another mini game, the person becomes actively resting on the mini game they aren't interacting with. And it is not to an intuitive person to understand why that's healthy or how does that affect the way they think and improve and behave in the long run. They don't have to. They don't have to be perceptive in that. But to a designer, to a developer, that is untapped potential. Being able to cleverly switch up the cadence of the game for those who can appreciate it intellectually, right, with perception, and those who can't. But ultimately, it's a human condition. So it is common in both, and ultimately they will appreciate it whether they know it or not. So where is that come in? Well, there are live service games that effectively prey. I'm going to use the word prey, sort of like take advantage. I'm going to say take advantage. I don't like exploit and prey. We'll say take advantage of FOMO, absolutely. But the even greater successful live service games are ones that also take into account idle periods, as in periods where, hey, you should just play other games for the time being. We'll take our time on curating the next thing. We're telling you guys, hey, here's a roadmap. You have 4 months. Go do something else. We'll be back in 4 months. It's okay. You're not going to miss anything. We're not going to pressure FOMO too hard for you to come back. And then when it gets introduced, the FOMO is kept to a minimum by saying, hey, you know what? You don't have to be here for the launch of the content. You can be here in any time in the next 4 months to complete this. So it's a bridge, it's a communication between the flexibility of being distracted and the mitigation of FOMO, but you're still taking advantage of that because the window has to be adjusted. It's like, hey, we'll give you 4 months. Or they could have chosen, we'll give you 1 week. You have to be here for 1 straight week. What you're doing is you're gauging the idea. And the ones that are incredibly successful struck the balance of, hey, all our commitments are incredibly flexible. But at the same time, you know when it's going to happen so that you aren't necessarily fear of missing out, right? And on top of that, when they understand how the human condition works with distractions and lifetimes and over time events, every other cycle they bring back something that could have been missed. Yes, at first it's controversial, it's a consternation, like some people say like, but I was here the first time. Now you're telling me the exclusive rewards that was in this event is gonna be brought back 2 years later? Then what's the point of having it being exclusive? It's like, it's a time exclusive. You will be here and you will have something that is slightly different from the thing being brought back. It can be identical, but what's happening is it's very distraught and dissonant with the current hustle culture that preys on FOMO. However, if you normalize that, now you're investing forward, because in the future, what will the gamer be saying? That exclusive hard person, that person might not be playing the game anymore. That's fine. The ones that are still playing, the first thing they're gonna say is, hey, you should join me and play this game, because in 2 years, don't worry about it. The things that you missed, they'll come back, and then we can do it together. So it's synergistic. And I can think of a few. Ironically or coincidentally, it's also Blizzard Entertainment. So like there are things that the bigger companies there are missteps and other, there are both proactive and non-proactive things. One thing is the rotation and the staggered rotation of exclusivity to offset FOMO, which is the idea I'm going to say like 2 years. So when a limited event cycles in on a live service event, it usually cycles back annually or biannually. So what happens is new players will have the sense that they didn't miss out. So that lowers the barrier. Returning players will be miffed. I mean, like consistent players may be initially miffed. It's like, well, now I understand. I get this forward investment, right? So if I was here for the event initially, I've already taken 80 to 90% of the value of having it initially. But then that 10% or 20%, I'm willing to give it up, because when it comes back, those people who missed it can join me. It's diminished return. So that type of thought gives an essence of time appreciation for diminished return and investment forward, right? And that is one of the crux of live service models. I play, arguably or debatably, I play 2 games that isn't by Blizzard Entertainment. One is continuously investing for, or attempting to like change their model to invest for. The other, just, I have a lot of criticisms. It's not sustainable. It's traditionalism, and traditionalism does not pave way for a contemporary audience. And I've voiced that quite a few times, and it's about Neverwinter Online and Cryptic Games, Cryptic Studios. The idea is, yes, if you want to preserve, their intent is for preservation, as in their old model and stuff. Well, the idea is is your community contemporary or old, right? So if you're thinking about preserving traditionalism, then you aren't investing forward. You are preserving. Naturally, preservation doesn't introduce innovation, nor does it increase inclusiveness. The gamer of today, if you want to grow your brand, the gamer of today is no longer the gamer of yesterday. So as you're introducing traditional designs, it has to meet the psychology and the sustainability, the standards and expectations that retain gamers of today. So there's an identity crisis here in design changes, and it's not which one's right or wrong to do so. If your intent is to grow, it's not preservation, it's inclusion. So inclusion tends to involve quality of life changes that demonstrates to the end user you are investing in them forward. So little tidbits like this makes me more and more confident that this developer is going to stay here for a long time, because whether they know it or not, their design language places the end user first. Like, what I mean is, yes, they're certainly portraying their product and content, but either by coincidence or by intention is very revealing what type of people they are by the design choices they make. They are investing forward. So why is this relevant? Well, you have to be a good judge of character. And a lot of people would, the short-sighted person would say, like, well, you can't judge people by their, looks or their superficial. Well, you can't be fully accurate with that, but you can practice understanding that, and statistically, in a long run, you are more likely to be accurate than inaccurate. Like, statistically, it will improve over time, much like how developers and publishers have to adapt to the dynamics of selling their game or communicating what their game means. So here lies what makes a great reviewer, or what makes an informative reviewer informative. Well, it's certainly not a person who has an op-ed projecting their own values. It makes for great entertainment, and the hustle bustle culture of viral videos synergizes with great entertainers in the most respectful way, with the utmost respect I can. That's where it ends. They are entertainers. They are investing in themselves forward. And the community will support that because it's reinforced by the current paradigm of the internet. I, for one, I can't empathize with that. I don't find merit in gaslighting, unintentionally gaslighting, and normalizing one's own opinion without the idea of collaborating between the bridges of people you talk to, not just people you influence. Because when you influence and lead, they're not offering you any retrospection on your actions and your influence. You're leading them. Personally, that's very sustainable, because if you have to talk to millions or can influence millions of people, that's very pragmatic. As a developer, I would prefer to understand that if I love making video games, I would also invest the time in showing images or showing intent and design qualities that would communicate both intuitively and intellectually that we also recognize that our end users, our audience, are humans, not necessarily to be exploited for money, which is made obvious by a lot of commentary, but also we put in designs that resonate with sentimentalism or resonate with health, you know? And breaks is a great one. It's a great topic. I can't tell you how difficult it is and how dissatisfying it is nowadays for me to communicate to someone and say, hey, you know, if you play this game 14 hours straight and try to get this no hit boss run, if you do this for 1 hour a day and just take the day off every 1 hour, you might actually reach the same place and you have 13 extra hours to do other things. You can prove me wrong, and I've already cited this. Arguably, it's a nocebo effect, but perhaps I will meet the outlier. But generally speaking, what that ends up is if you have now let's add in one last topic, the population statistics. If the grand scheme of things, the average developer and the publisher and the average end user community also have this perspective, it just increases volume and productivity. So inherently, it's a win-win based on contemporary requirements. This doesn't mean what I'm suggesting won't lead to new problems or new oversights or trade-offs. I can think of a few trade-offs, right? Productivity might not be fast. So what I mean is, it may be productive and consistent, but perhaps technology and the internet, it's not practical. It's not fast enough to do so. Like say, if you're fronting a mainstream paradigm of taking it slow and investing in human beings, well, it's impractical when you think about generative AI, capitalistic business models, private ventures, cost of living, inflation, resource management. There are a lot of counter arguments and refuting that can be a big trade-off that becomes a new problem. So it's not a win-win. It's a win-win only in the context of what is valued today, which is basically everything the hustle culture doesn't do. Mitigate FOMO, mitigate individual gaslighting. So like an influencer or someone who commands who unintentionally gaslights, not for malicious reasons, just sharing their opinion incredibly passionately and swaying people with their passion. For better or for worse. For being right or for being wrong. When it's right, everyone's happy. When it's wrong, it's passionately destroyed too, right? So all this like hustle culture, it blends into passion and zeros and ones. Everyone is extremely interacting and making clear-cut decisions because the internet is reinforcing that. What does a world in which my paradigm that I'm suggesting here is mainstream? Well, you won't get direct answers anymore. It's hard to get direct answers, and you're gonna constantly have to wait on things. You're constantly having to trust and place your faith in other human beings. Things don't happen very quickly, right? So all that framework can be inconvenience. It's largely inconvenient to wait and be patient and understand breaks and efficiency and treating other people like humans. It introduces inconveniences. Inconveniences that slow down the pace. So I'm making a counter argument to all the trade-offs of my suggested priorities. And thus lies the coexistence of what is mainstream now and what is indie now. Indie's pace is so entirely different from the pace of mainstream. And for me, personally, I gravitate towards indie because of that. And that's a great example for games like this, with little beats like this. You don't get beats like this. It can be in mainstream. It's just not the time yet. Like, think about I think the current mainstream population has become more and more receptive to this because the vast majority of people now are suffering from insecurity. The target audience, right? So even something as simple as letting someone pet a virtual digital animal in the hustle and bustle of a live service game becomes a highlight that almost, for better or for worse, erase the merits of every other design in the game. Like, for example, you finally beat the boss, and then the next thing happens is you get a scene where you just see the virtual character literally allow you to pet a dog. And that moment illustrates, like, I can think of a few examples of this happening, something similar. That sentimentalism returns in spades. Like, it's so responsive. It's electric when it comes to citing moments that stick out in a game. That is a great observational result that would indicate that the paradigm is shifting away from building games that are constantly pushing the robotic gamer forward, not the human being that needs time to breathe and pet a cute dog and look at scenery. The paradigm is shifting, though. And what I mean by that is, at some point, developers, even indie developers now, have to pay, attention, or maybe like their publisher needs to prioritize the trends of the increase in puzzles, the increase in storytelling. It's kind of a response to the oversaturation of action-oriented, hustle-bustle, high-paced stuff. It's less receptive now over time, and eventually that might be the new norm again. And what I mean again is it's already happened. That's how video games started, actually. A lot of the earlier video games. Then maybe it'll transition back to an action-oriented thing, but it's something that you don't have to be a game developer to appreciate, because if you're a teacher, or you have to explain something, or provide some communication advice, or have loved ones that struggle with things, their personalities, their problems and behaviorisms is normalized by the changing dynamics of human society. And the internet is a microcosm, and it actually moves quite dynamically and quickly relative to the noisier outside, right? The noisier offline world is far less predictable. So because of that noise, there's no really strong paradigm shifting, but the internet does. Like, relatively speaking. And in order to be a successful, in my opinion, a consistently successful developer, publisher, something that where the target audience is the microcosm of the internet. These things are incredibly important. And for someone who's the end user, right now I need to talk about the end user. For myself, I would say as weirdly flexible as I can. Like I'll weirdly flex one thing. The things I focus on actually does make me a great judge of character. Do I use this to my advantage? No. Because generally speaking, a person who's a great judge of character also knows not to abuse it. And that's kind of my 2 cents. I don't know if I am a really good judge of character or not. I mean, obviously I don't associate with professionals. But what I like to believe is I have some semblance of judgment when it comes to design choices, creative freedom, observing behavior and associating them with the people that are making them. Because if you understand the person producing something or saying something, you don't really need to know technically what they're going to do, because you know the person. If you know the person, you probably know what they're going to do or how they're going to respond. It's not what literally or accurately they're going to produce, because that's up to their creativity, but you know their intent, and their intent will make you often incredibly consistent. So when you spend most of your time, like myself, I suppose, I think I spend at least 80 to 90% of my time thinking about the correlations between specific behaviors to the product they demonstrate and like to offer and sell to language, and not necessarily like different languages, but more on that later. The way they communicate. So these cues, yes, they are incredibly complex, and you will be inaccurate in the sense of knowing all the details, like the semantics. Ultimately, though, it will increase your frequency of understanding who to follow, who meets your requirements, who to trust. And I don't mean trust as in are they doing evil doing or stuff, just conflicts of interest, right? And for me, my overall gaming experience, at least the ones I voluntarily choose, have often been positive. And generally speaking, that isn't coming from hating something or excluding something. It's coming from what to look for. There's a difference between looking for something and excluding things so that they don't have avoiding undesirable things is different from looking for things you want. You need to understand what you don't want by doing what you don't want, right? And when you're looking for something you want, oftentimes people think they're doing that, but they're actually excluding all the things they don't want actively, which provides zero experience. That's also part of the hustle bustle. It actually converges on the hustle bustle. What's another thing that YouTube and developers and publishers don't really want to do? They want to avoid everything that people don't want. Not slowly introduce them or find an amicable way of introducing something new and normalizing it and easing it in. It's, hey guys, we know what you want, but we really want to do something new. How do we do that? Well, we're just going to do it. It's like, oh, you hate it? It's like, oh, I'm sorry. We forgot to tell you or show you that this is a new mechanic, and we're really proud of it. There's no way in the video game it's that. It's more, we did this change. We're the developers, right? We want it to change. It's not a working dialogue between the developers and the community. While at the same time, the community will respond in the same way the developer does. It's like, well, I don't want this in my game that you make. just as how abruptly that change was introduced by the developers without the hindsight of interacting with the community. This is mainstream things. They just do it. And both, it's crazy. It's kind of more like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree situation. So you can actually imagine the mainstream developer and publisher as a parental figure who have privileged knowledge and the power to do whatever they desire at the cost of, their responsibilities and consequences. They are aware of that. Their conditioned parts are their progenitors, as in the end users, the people who consume. So the kids, whether you're 60 or 40, if you're consuming someone's product, you have an element of uncontrolled things. But what you can do is offer the same criticisms or like offer an opinion on it. Well, when a developer actively chooses to not communicate that there will be changes in the next game that breaks away from tradition, the developer would be willing to accept the consequences that their end user will reflect that. They will dislike the abrupt changes without notice, and they will give you it equally as unexpected response. If it works out, the response would be incredible, right? But unexpected. Incredible but unexpected. If it's terrible, it will be incredibly unexpectedly terrible. Because in both cases, the developer made an abrupt change, and so does the community. The community behaves the same way. Like, it's a reflection. It's like a feedback loop between the two. So if you have, so how do you find insight into what a game developer will do, or like their motivations and how they feel, like their judgment of character? Well, I can name a few games that I play where the developer and the community are like parents and kids, where they are constantly like amicable parents and kids, or even colleagues of each other, where you can see, yeah, it slows down innovation. It slows down like really abrupt changes, but what it does is it consistently becomes positive. Like, oh, hey, I know what you guys are saying. Here's what I think about it. And what do you guys think? It's like, okay, let's meet halfway. And then the game continues to move at a steady pace, but it's also sustainable, incredibly sustainable. I play a game like that, and I really respect the developers, the developer mainly specifically, and then the community it fosters. It also makes it really hard to break in, but we talked about that a bit. That's a good place to stop. It's a very humbling situation. And what I discussed here is not the current mainstream paradigm. It's the minor paradigm. So both exist, and they both are successfully working out right now. When they're not working out, well, you're not going to hear from them anymore, right? It's a little bit of a digression, but I love it. That's what this little coffee thing reminds me of. And to end it, that is why I take breaks. If the developer decided that it's a great idea to place a coffee stop in the middle of your game, I'll take a break too. It's a way to empathize with the developer. All right. Because of that digression, no, I can totally do 3 more, right? I'll do 3 more.